So, yeah, I think it's, for us, a great privilege, really, to have this chance to address you at the start of your university careers. And what a fantastically exciting time for you all. But I have to tell you, I don't envy you. And the reason I don't envy you is because, as I look around the room, with a very few exceptions, most of you are significantly younger than me. And I think there is a very real possibility that the latter part of the lives of most people in this room is going to be grim or non-existent. And I'm sorry to have to say it. And I hear laughter. People don't usually say this kind of thing. Right? There's a taboo around it. And that's partly what I want to talk about. As you may know, we're here at the University of East Anglia. We have one of the world-leading environmental science departments, especially on climate science. And what they tell us is extremely grim. I mean, if you read their papers or read popular versions of their papers, they suggest that unless our species manages to turn itself around in quite a dramatic way, the future within your lifetimes is going to be unrecognizable and unrecognizably worse. And also, it's actually even worse than that, because if you manage to talk to them off the record, if you get them in the bar or something, and maybe you'll have the chance of doing that in the next few years, they will tend to say things like, well, you know, actually in our papers, we're pretty conservative. It could be a lot worse than that. And I actually think that you in this room here today should be very angry against the generation that's older than you and the generation above that. Because there's been what I would call a festival of recklessness or a carnival of short-termism that has characterized the last couple of generations that potentially leaves you in a very parlous position. And it's all too easy, I'm afraid, for such kinds of festivals to turn into funerals. So, what are we to do about this? So I want to suggest two things immediately we need to do by way of thinking about this. And one is that we need to think about this problem and address it in every possible way, including philosophically. I'm a philosopher. What does it mean to address it philosophically? It means that we have to imagine, we have to try to imagine, for example, how different a future will be if we get to the point, which we may well get to well within your lifetimes, where it becomes clear that for the foreseeable future, each generation is going to have a worse life than the generation that came before it. If that happens, that's going to be an enormous change in human consciousness, because for so long we've thought that what life was essentially about was about having a good time and bequeathing a better life to the next generation. It's going to be an enormous psychological, philosophical value challenge. And secondly, I think we need to think about it in terms of the difficulty we have in thinking about it, which I suspect is symbolized by the sort of slightly nervous titters of laughter which went up as I started speaking. Why is it that we actually find it so difficult to face this kind of horrific possibility which may soon become a reality? I think one reason is the notorious frog in boiling water syndrome, which many of you are probably aware of. You put frogs in warm water and you gradually heat up the water. Eventually you have a boiled frog. And the question, of course, is why didn't the frog jump out when the water started getting really hot? And the answer that's standardly given is because the temperature was going up so gradually it barely noticed. And that, of course, is precisely the situation that we are in as a species. But now here I want to tell you something hopeful. It's not true. Most frogs do actually jump out. You turn up the temperature enough, your average frog will jump out. And I think we should take some hope from that. If frogs are smart enough to sort this out, then surely we should be. A great philosopher, a great applied philosopher you've probably heard of, Karl Marx, once said that human beings only set themselves such problems as they can solve. and I think he's right. Only I think the problem that I'm talking about here is a very, very difficult one to solve. So it's going to require a lot of work. It's going to require a lot of intellectual effort, for starters. So am I in despair? Well, no, as I say, if frogs can do it, then so can we. Let's show that in this respect, at least, Marx was right. So that's why I've been thinking, along with some others in recent years, about ways in which we might start to seek to change this culture of incredible recklessness and short-termism that we find ourselves in. That is, committing us to serious risks of complete civilizational breakdown within a century or so, and something which comes close to that within the lifetimes of many of you in this room. So I want to share with you quickly 2 ideas that I've been working with along with others for how we might seek to make that change. The first idea, some of you may have heard of, it's called the precautionary principle. And what the precautionary principle basically says is, where there is a risk of a serious, potentially catastrophic and irreversible harm, then you don't need to wait for full evidence, you don't need to wait for full scientific proof before acting to forestall that harm. So what does that mean in concrete terms? Well, for example, with regard to climate, what it would mean is that rather than us having to prove categorically that the climate scientists are right and that their models can be 100% relied upon, they're models that show that if we continue on a business-as-usual type path, we will have several degrees of global warming by the end of the century, which might not sound so bad, but believe you me, when you realize that we've only had 1 degree so far, and we've already had the massive floods here a few years ago, we have already had the kinds of catastrophes that are regularly visited now on countries like Bangladesh, you'd know that it actually is an epocally appalling proposition. In relation to climate, what the precautionary principle would say is, we don't need to wait for that kind of full scientific proof before taking strong, precautious action. And then, in fact, it would be reckless. It would be reckless to wait until we have that kind of proof before taking that kind of action. If the precautionary principle were to become a guiding principle of our societies and of our polities, well, then the world might start to look very different, and the prognosis might start to look very different. And the second idea is an idea that I've developed myself, which is called guardians for future generations. And the idea goes like this. We seem to have a problem in that we are prone, especially nowadays, we could talk about why that is. We are prone, it seems, to this kind of recklessness and short-termism, symbolized, for example, by us chucking more and more greenhouse gases up into the atmosphere as if there's no tomorrow, which might well eventually, unfortunately, be the case if we carry on with the chucking. We seem to be stuck in a form of short-termist reasoning which our normal modes of governance and government don't seem very good at getting us out of. So politicians famously have relatively short time horizons. It's very difficult for them to think further than the next election. In fact, in many cases, it's very difficult for them to think further than the next news cycle, which nowadays has shrunk to about 24 hours. So what if we were to have an institutional change which would make it possible and indeed necessary for people to think in a long-termist way? My thought experiment here was, what if future generations, what if your children and their children were here with us now? What would they tell us to do? Or more precisely, what would they tell us not to do or to stop doing? Now, of course, until one of our colleagues in physics or maths or something invents a time travel machine, this is going to be impossible to realize in any straightforward sense. What if we could create an institution that acted as a kind of proxy, that somehow represented future generations without us having to have a time travel machine? And that's the nub of my idea, which is to suggest that as well as having our ordinary houses of parliament, there should be something like a third house that sits above them, which would have in it representatives of future generations who would be empowered to strike down any laws, including the government's budget, insofar as those laws recklessly endangered future generations by, for example, committing us to further climate-dangerous greenhouse gas emissions on a large scale. Who should those representatives be? Who would the guardians for future generations be? Plato, a great ancient philosopher, said they should be philosophers, which I'll confess to you is an appealing idea for someone like me, and perhaps for some of you, but I think not very well suited to our democratic sensibilities and time. So my suggestion in developing this proposal of guardians for future generations is that actually the guardians should be each and any one of us, by which I mean there should be a random selection of the population who would be given this awesome responsibility of seeking to represent the future. You could think of them as a kind of super jury. We give juries an awesome responsibility to stand in for the rest of us in judging wrongdoers. This would be a sort of super jury representing our descendants who would be placed in the same kind of position. And again, they could, and I think should, be drawn democratically from each and any one of us. So those are my two suggestions. I don't know if they'll work, I don't know if they'll be enough, but one thing I do know, that we need some kind of creative thinking and we need some radical answers. Otherwise, we're going to be in the situation which I started out by describing, where in 5 or 10 years' time, I'm up here again feeling even less envious of those in the audience. Because I don't want it to be like that. I would like to be envious of you in every way as you start this incredible adventure of your university education. And I think there's nothing worse for human beings than the thought that they might be bequeathing to their descendants a worse world than the world that they currently have. Thank you.